Welcome back to another impactful episode of the PSTA podcast. I'm Craig King, your host, and I'm with your favorite guest of all time. I think the rankings came out last week, and Patrick Kelly took all three top spots, fourth being no one.
Is that like a preseason ranking in college football? Because usually the teams that get way up there in the preseason aren't there at the end. So
it's usually how it works. Kind of like in college basketball, the Kansas Jayhawks. Sorry, Kansas fans, they were preseason number one, and them
and UConn. It's been a rough year.
Been a rough year. So.
It's still a better year than being a Gamecock basketball fan on the men's side.
On the men's side. Yeah.
In Don Staley, we trust.
Yeah, in Don Staley, we trust. Well, I'll go ahead and get this out of the way before we start talking about policy. 49ers, my team is pretty much gutted. Like I think they might actually sign me in free agency because we have no one.
Upgrade.
Yeah. But we still have our kicker, which I'm still trying to figure that out. But anyway.
In Brock Purdy, we trust?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look, if he's going to prove anything, going to have to prove it now.
Purdy's going to throw to himself.
So, Patrick, they're not here to hear us talk about snacks and sports and all that good stuff, but I do feel like our fans do appreciate this at the beginning.
All three of them. My mom thinks it's hysterical.
Yeah, it's all good. So let's start with the budget. What a night you had last night.
Yeah, nothing says excitement quite like being at the South Carolina State House till 11:45 p.m., but that's all right. This is government at work, and it is good that we have a process that allows for debate and transparency and the fact that we can sit there and watch the whole thing play out. But it was a long 2-day stretch. The House came into session at 1 o'clock on Monday, on Monday, March 10th. And they ran till about 7:30, 8 o'clock on Monday night. And then on Tuesday, they came in at 10 a.m., and they didn't get done till Wednesday because they gave the budget second reading at about 11:40 p.m. on Tuesday night. They adjourned for 20 minutes, and then they came back into session at 12:01 a.m. because it's a new day, and House rules require that a bill can only receive one reading per day. So it got third reading on Wednesday, which was 20 minutes after it got second reading. So, the calendar's a magic thing.
It is. So as it relates to education, were there any changes on the House floor as it relates to education? Pretty much everything that the House Ways and Means Committee passed out?
Absolutely no changes to funding lines. Okay. So the high-level funding lines, the extra $112 million to state aid to classrooms, the $1,500 increase to every cell at the bachelor's, master's plus 30, doctorate lanes of the salary schedule, the $20 million for school safety, the roughly $6 million for school leadership accelerator program at the Department of Education. All the funding levels stayed the same. There were a couple of provisos, which are one-year policy actions that are added to the budget that direct how state funds can and cannot be expended. Teachers became very familiar with the term proviso over the last 12 months because that's how the free-to-focus cell phone policy exists. It's a proviso in the budget that basically says if a district wants to receive its state aid to classroom dollars, it has to have a free-to-focus policy. So there are a couple of K-12 provisos that got added on the floor, but no changes to the funding levels. I would say probably the two most K-12 provisos that were introduced on the floor were ruled out of order because they were not germane to, and germane is just a fancy legislative word for spending. So they were found to not be relevant to the actual expenditure of state funds. They were policies in and of themselves, not direction of how state funds are expended. So most of them got struck down. One that made it to the end that is an interesting concept is Representative Fawn Petalino out of Clarendon County put up a proviso that addressed what I learned something from the representative on Tuesday, and I credit her for listening to the teachers and the families in her district. Allegedly, in her home district, benchmark assessments, which teachers are pretty familiar with, have been used not for formative assessment purposes and seeing where students stand relative to the standards in preparation for state summative assessments in May. They've been used for grading purposes. And so a kid taking a benchmark in the fall, every teacher knows this, kids don't do real well on fall benchmarks because you haven't taught all the standards yet.
Right.
but those were being used for grades. And Representative Petalino was very concerned about that because she'd heard from lots of families in her community that were very concerned. And so she put up a proviso, and I'll put the specific language of the proviso in the Legislative Alert Network email on Friday so people can check it out, that basically forbids a district from using a benchmark-like assessment, a non-teacher generated assessment for grading purposes unless all the content on the assessment has already been taught. So that's an interesting concept, and the House did adopt that. The other proviso action of note is that the Ways and Means Committee had put into the budget a proviso prohibiting so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, directing that no state agency, including local school districts, could use state funds for DEI-related activities. That proviso was taken out of the budget on the House floor, not because it was voted down, but because it was challenged under that same germaneness point of order that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And the presiding officer ruled that the proviso was out of order, and they stripped it out of the budget. So it is not in the final budget that made it from the House to the Senate.
So sounds like an eventful day. And to make note, the House, when they finished their work, they decided they're going to furlough next week, so they won't be back until March 25th. And so,
they're out, and they probably need it. I mean, they're tired, and there were some fiery speeches on the floor of the House during budget debate. I think one that a lot of members will see on social media is a speech by Representative Davey Hyatt out of Pickens County, the House Majority Leader, who said some pretty important things about educators in his speech. He was angered that the budget had been labeled as loaded with, quote, crap. Sorry, Mom, that I just used that term, but that was the term. And so Representative Hyatt went to the podium and he said that he doesn't think that the teachers of our state are crap, or law enforcement officers, or families, or students. So it was a pretty passionate defense of public educators and public servants. It got standing applause, which doesn't happen in the House all that often.
Yeah, that's good to make note of. And so the Senate will have their crack at the budget. When do you anticipate that probably happening?
That's still a few weeks out. The Senate Education Finance subcommittees are wrapping up their last few agency hearings over the next 2 weeks. The big one in K-12 is that Superintendent Weaver has still not gone before the subcommittee to give the department's agency request. I anticipate that in the next week or two. Once those are done, the full Senate Finance Committee will meet. And typically the Senate, I cannot remember the calendar off the top of my head, but they're typically wrapping up their budget work at the end of April, and it will then pass back over to the House, and the House will have one more bite at the budget apple. It's what the House calls H2, meaning the second budget. And then it will go to a conference committee between the two in that first week, start of the second week in May.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you for that budget update, Patrick. So we have the Educator Assistance Act, which was pretty cool today. It was in a Senate subcommittee, and we had our Kershaw County Teacher Forum there today, witnessing that discussion. Anything you want to add to that piece of legislation?
Yeah, the exciting thing is it came out of subcommittee today. So the subcommittee that was assigned to that bill met for the second time. And basically what they did is they heard and accepted amendments that were proposed by committee staff based on feedback that had been provided in public testimony a week ago, as well as written feedback provided. Most of the amendments that were adopted, I would say, are technical in nature. None of the core policies that PSTA is so strongly supported in the Educator Assistance Act were removed. It would instead is just kind of cleaning up language so it plays nicer with existing state code, but nothing of substance that would alarm PSTA to go, wait a second, that's eliminating one of the core policy goals. And so the subcommittee adopted it. One interesting conversation was around the breach of contract provision, that the bill changes the language in state law from in the instance that a local board reports an educator to the state board for a licensure action due to mid-year breach of contract. Current law says the state board shall suspend the certificate. The Educator Assistance Act says the state board may suspend the certificate, so it gives the board discretion. Senator Michael Johnson from York County, whose wife is an educator, really kind of leaned in on that and said, He didn't like even that because he gave the example of if he needed to move to Charleston and his family needed to move to Charleston, he didn't like the idea that his wife could lose her ability to earn a living because the family wanted to stay together. And so he asked staff to develop an amendment, and we'll have to see the text of this when it goes to full education committee, but we know it's coming because the full subcommittee agreed with Senator Johnson. But he proposed that if a teacher is making a bona fide change of residence, that in effect eliminates the ability for a local board to report a teacher for breach as long as the bona fide change of residence, it requires movement to a non-contiguous county. So Senator Johnson was not, I live in Richland too. I could go work in Fairfield County without moving my house. I mean, right. Some of the Fairfield schools are closer to my house than some of the Richland 2 schools. Yep. That's not what he was talking about. He was talking about you literally have to uproot your family and move. And the senator's point was he doesn't know a whole lot of people that'll go through the rigmarole of selling a house, buying a house, moving a house. And his point was, if you are willing to do that, then there's probably deeper problems in that school district anyway than worrying about your certificate. So that was encouraging to see Senator Johnson really kind of step in there and step up for teachers.
Yeah, that was a cool interchange, and so we look forward to see what that amendment looks like. So last thing I want to touch on, Patrick, you already touched on the DEI proviso that was ruled not germane to the budget. But there is a piece of legislation on DEI that is in the House currently.
H 3927.
H 3927. So talk about that.
Yeah, so that bill is a comprehensive piece of legislation, and sponsors of the bill have shared with me that it is largely taken from the text of an executive order signed by President Trump when he came into office in January, and attempts to apply that language to all state entities, whether that be an agency, a county government, a university, a local school district, a charter school. If you're a state-funded entity, then the bill would apply. And, some of the bill deals with the kind of policies and programs that have been central to the so-called DEI debates of the last few years. It's things like prohibition on consideration of race and sex in hiring practices, prohibition on consideration of race and sex in admissions practices or scholarship awarding, or having an office dedicated to diversity, equity, inclusion in a university. That's been a big point of discussion for the last 2 years. But this bill goes a lot further. Yeah. And so there's some things in it that really give us some pause because obviously it applies to K-12 schools now, traditional and charter public schools. It had a hearing before the full education committee last week, so the week of March the 3rd. 5 to 6 hours of testimony. 64 people spoke on the bill, roughly. I may have missed one in my tally because it was a while, but not a single person spoke in favor of the bill. And so there's a few things in it that PSTA has some concerns about.
What are some of those specifics that are giving us pause as an association?
Yeah, I mean, language matters in a bill, and you need to be precise. And so I'll give you 2 concrete examples from the plain text of the bill. The bill defines diversity, equity, and inclusion, among other things, as any attempt or effort to promote policies or procedures designed or implemented in reference to race or sex. So it's important to dig in on what exactly does that mean, because a policy or procedure designed or implemented in reference to race or sex would mean anything that is on the basis of the race or sex of students. And we've already seen that this has had, the application of the executive order that uses the same language has had some significant impact in South Carolina. If people didn't see in the news, Ashley Hall Preparatory School down in Charleston a few weeks ago is an all-girls school, and they're a private school, and they host a annual Girls in Engineering Day. I'm a dad of 2 daughters. I love the idea. Let's have Girls in Engineering Day. And they partnered with the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to hold this day, because who needs great engineers more than the Army Corps of Engineers?
Absolutely.
Well, the Army Corps of Engineers had to cancel the contract with Ashley Hall because it is literally a policy or procedure designed or implemented in reference to sex. Lawrence County 55 had a teacher quality grant through the U.S. Department of Education that was to provide strategic compensation to attract teachers to a school district that has a hard time recruiting and retaining teachers because it's rural and all the factors that we know. And in writing the application, according to Lawrence County 55 School District, the application noted that Lawrence County has a diverse student body. Well, it does. Like anybody that's been to Lawrence County, it has a diverse student body. But that was enough to get it flagged as a program that, or a policy or procedure designed or implemented in reference to race because it talked about diversity. So the grant got canceled.
So I'm hearing a lot of possible unintended consequences.
Sure. I mean, I'll give you two concrete examples in my backyard. Anybody that knows me know that both of my daughters run. They are runners on cross country and track teams. And for my oldest, that started in a program called Girls on the Run when she was in elementary school. It's a program in schools across the state, but it is Girls on the Run. That is a program in reference to sex. That would, and I'm not being hyperbolic, if the U.S. Department of Education can't do Girls in Engineering Day, under that language, how in the world would a school district be able to defend Girls on the Run? Yeah. In Richland School District 2, we have a choice program, a world-class, award-winning choice program, not just open enrollment, but magnet programs to meet the needs and desires of families. One of the most popular programs in Richland 2 is 2 academies at Dent Middle School that is based on sex. It takes middle schoolers, and you're either in a all-girls environment or an all-boys environment. Parents love that program, and we're in a moment in public education in this country where parental choice is something that's elevated. Now, I can support that. I'm a parent, for crying out loud. Yeah. But I don't know how 2 academies is anything other than a policy or procedure designed or implemented in reference to sex.
Yeah.
Like, it's a single gender academy, for crying out loud.
Yeah. So it sounds like, and again, I think you said it. It was modeled after the executive orders, and we saw some consequences because of that. But then we also see some in our own backyard here in South Carolina where just that blanket terminology is going to cause some unintended consequences. I would fare to think that some of either the sponsors or co-sponsors may not want these things to happen. And so anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, one other example from the bill, using the plain text, another section of the bill says that any government agency in this state, including school districts, is prohibited from spending any money appropriated or authorized for any contract with a private company that has DEI policies. So again, because DEI is defined in the bill as any policy or procedure in reference to race or sex, I'll just give you 2 concrete examples that I think any family in South Carolina would be concerned about. The College Board has research on their website and policies promoting access for traditionally underserved students, which we know are typically minority and lower income students, to access advanced placement programs. That is a policy in reference to race. So that would mean, under my plain reading of the text, that a school district or the State Department of Education would have to be really careful before they sign a contract with the College Board. And if we can't sign a contract with the College Board, well, that means the free SAT administration that every South Carolina high school student is eligible for in their junior year, gone. Free AP exams for students paid for by the state, gone. Access to tagging courses as AP, which is important for high school transcripts for students in every community in the state, gone. Another example is NWEA. That is the organization behind the MAP formative assessment that we frequently use in districts across the state. For our formative assessment protocols in the fall, winter, and spring, they have research on their website about documenting the mountain of research that shows that students perform better when they have access to diverse teachers, especially for minority students to have access to teachers of their race. But the research shows that actually all students benefit from that. And that's just on NWA's website because they're a research entity. That's what they do. But what is that research other than a policy in reference to race well, I don't think you could contract with them. Or I certainly
on the language.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm an attorney, which I'm not, so full disclosure, I mean, I did stay in a Holiday Inn Express, but
But Patrick, you had a desire early on to possibly be an attorney, so that
that's true.
It's in there. It's deep in
that's
there.
a podcast for another day.
Okay, all right. I digress.
But with the point being around contracting, I mean, again, the Department of Defense walked away from a contract with a private school in South Carolina because of the issue of a policy in reference to sex. So I think at minimum, it has a chilling effect on districts.
Yeah.
At medium, it's a whole lot of work for districts to evaluate every single policy of everyone they contract with. And it further says subcontractors. So districts that are building new schools, have fun. It's not just the contractor, it's everyone they subcontract with to come in and build your new school. But at worst, it means that we can't access these programs that are universally supported and used across South Carolina.
Yeah. So we had a hearing, and you mentioned the hearing had 64 or 65 that testified.
Mm-hmm.
Where are we next with this piece of legislation, you think?
So at the end of that hearing, Chair Lady Shannon Erickson, the chair of the Education Committee, announced that there would be another hearing at a to-be-determined date where public testimony would be heard again. So I anticipate that will occur within the next week or two. That'll be in our Legislative Alert Network email that we send out to PSTA members once it's announced. But knowing how Chair Lady Erickson operates, she is very cognizant of getting full public feedback before she moves any significant piece of legislation. And obviously this one is significant if 5 hours worth of people showed up to talk about it. So I don't anticipate in that next committee hearing that the Chair Lady or her committee would entertain amendments or they would vote to advance the bill to the full House. I think they will probably hear from the public at least one more time. Then maybe the committee comes back and starts engaging in the legislative work of potentially amending the text and possibly moving it to the full House floor. So I think we're still several weeks away from this bill moving, but I think that there's lots of opportunities right now for individuals to share specific concerns. And in doing so, I would encourage them to use the specific text of the bill because that's important because you've got to be able to speak to concrete examples of the impact that the bill would have in your community. We'll link the text of the bill in this week's Legislative Alert Network email, but if you read something and you've got a question, just contact PSTA and we'll help you navigate how to read legislation.
Yeah, that's an important note that Patrick used. Utilize what's actually in the text of the bill and not a summary you just see online, a random story, you may hear about it. While there may be some truth in that, you want to make sure that when you're contacting your elected officials in print, email, calling them on the phone or engaging them in your communities, that you're using actual language from the bill. So we'll make sure that that's linked to our LAN. Anything else, Patrick?
No, I think that covers it.
All right. So shout out to the 2 Hill days we had this week. We had Sumter and Kershaw. Next week, we have our first round of Teaching Fellows Hill Days. So we're excited to have half of those institutions come next Tuesday. And then we'll have Lee County on next Wednesday, the 19th. So I'm excited to have them engaged in the legislative process. It's Craig King, your favorite host, and your favorite guest, Patrick Kelly. We'll see you next time.